My name is Charlotte, and today I'll be presenting my final assessment. So my presentation consists of two sections. Section 1 is the analysis of a moral issue, while Section 2 is the critical reflection on AI ethical responses. So for Section 1, the moral discussed is the fast fashion industry and the conflict between the affordable and rapidly produced clothing, worker exploitations, and environmental harm. The article from Anti-Slavery International highlights concerns about very long working hours, low wages, and environmental damage associated with the fast fashion business model. Therefore, the issue is not only about the one company, but also about the wider fast fashion industry. So for this part of the assessment, I was required to consider Rowe's prima facie duty theory. The main duties relevant to the issue are non-maleficence, justice, and beneficence. The beneficence recognize that affordable clothing can provide benefits to consumers, especially consumers with limited purchasing power. However, non-maleficence requires businesses to avoid causing harm, while justice requires fair treatment of workers and communities. Therefore, the assessment required me to consider the conflict between the providing affordable products and preventing harm. So my conclusion is that when low price depends on serious and preventable exploitation, justice and non-maleficence should have greater priority. Also, the assessment also required me to consider Kantian ethics, particularly the idea that people should be treated as end is themselves rather than merely as a means. So in the fast fashion context, workers should not simply be viewed as cheap labor used to achieve low production costs and higher profits. So they have their own dignity and value. Consumers should also receive sufficient information about production conditions so they can make informed choices. Also, another perspective required in the assessment is ethical relativism. So this perspective recognizes that different societies may have different cultural and economic standards. So for example, some societies may place greater importance on affordable clothing, employment opportunities, and economic development. However, the assessment also highlights a limitation of relativism. Cultural differences should be considered, but they should not become an excuse for serious and preventable exploitation. So overall, my final judgment in Section 1 is the fast fashion becomes morally unjustifiable when low price and rapid production depend on significant worker exploitation and environmental harm. Therefore, companies should improve supply chain transparency and working conditions. Government should strengthen the enforcement, and consumers should consider purchasing fewer and longer-lasting products. So moving to Section 2, I use Gemini to analyze the moral issues of the Johor River pollutions. So the assessments require me to start with the questions, critically evaluate the moral issue in the article, and explain what is the right thing to do. And this is the part that I developed, the discussion through 10 further prompts. So for prompt 1, I asked the AI to identify the main moral issues and explain the right action. So the response identified the environmental injustice, corporate responsibility, and governance failures. So my thinking was the company should not only face the penalties, it should also compensate affected communities and contribute to restoring the river. So for prompt 2, I asked whether the pollution had unfairly distributed environmental benefits and burdens. So this made me realize that the company could receive economic benefits while vulnerable communities, fishermen, and water users experience much greater environmental and economic burdens. Therefore, the pollution is also an issue of fairness and unequal impact. For prompt 3, I asked the AI to use the stakeholders theory to identify the key stakeholders. So the stakeholders include the Orang Asli community, local residents, business employees, shareholders, regulators, Singapore's PUB, and the natural environment. So from this response, I realized that the companies have responsibility beyond their shareholders. In this case, vulnerable communities and other stakeholders were significantly affected by the company's activities. For prompt 4, I asked whether it is morally acceptable for a company to pursue economic benefits if its operations create a serious risk or for innocent communities. The context perspective helped me to understand that the people should not be treated merely as a means of achieving profit. Therefore, economic benefits should not justify imposing serious and preventable risks on communities. For prompt 5, I asked who should be morally responsible for the pollution, the company, managers, employees, or regulators. So my conclusion was that responsibility is shared, but it is not equal. The company and its manager have the responsibility because they have control over the operations and decisions. So regulators also have responsibility if monitoring and enforcement are weak. However, ordinary employees generally have less responsibility because they have less authority and decision-making power. And for prompt 6, I asked, can the moral issues be resolved through compensation alone, or does justice require environmental restorations and long-term preventions? So my thinking is that the issue also involves justice because environmental benefits and burdens are distributed unequally. So compensation also can help affected communities recover economically, but money cannot fully compensate for losses caused by a damaged river or lost trust. Therefore, the company should also restore the environment and establish a long-term preventive measures to ensure similar harm does not happen again. For prompt 7, I consider how affected stakeholders should be involved in deciding compensations and restoration. And I realized that the compensation should not be decided only by the company. Fishermen, residents, and community leaders should have a meaningful voice because they understand their losses and dependence on the river. And for prompt act, I asked what qualities responsible business leaders should demonstrate, and the response identified the virtues such as prudence, justice, moral courage, stewardship, honesty, and transparency. So my main reflection is that the ethical leadership is not only about following rules. Leaders also need good character and should have the courage to prevent harm before it occurs. So for prompt 9, I asked about the ethical responsibilities of the government regulators and whether weak monitoring could reduce the company's moral responsibility. And I concluded that the regulators have an important responsibility to protect the public through proper monitoring and enforcement. However, weak government monitoring does not remove the company's own moral responsibility. Companies still have an independent duty to prevent foreseeable harm. So finally, for prompt 10, I asked what the company should do now based on the stakeholder theory, hunting ethics, and the virtue ethics. So my final judgment is that the company should go beyond the minimum legal compliance. It should compensate affected communities, restore the Johor River, involve stakeholders in the process, and introduce permanent preventative measures into its operations.